Well, here we are at the end of October, and last night when Judy and I sat down to dinner, she said, okay, now let's agree that we're not going to talk about anything related to COVID. Let's not talk about anything related to politics. And so we had a nice quiet dinner. Actually, that's not quite true, because the question then came up about, did you see the email and see the new guidelines for worship at Mount Zion, and which obviously was a COVID related question. So we were back talking about COVID, and which eventually evolved into discussion about politics and everything that's going on. And let's admit, it's been all consuming. It has been a challenging time, and will continue to be so. And it's been good though. It's been good as we read these lessons, and the lesson today is the fourth in the series within the quarterly that talks about who we are and how we got to where we are as a people and our faith. And it's been a good lesson series. This week our lesson, which is from our quarterly, is in Luke. And so it's a much more familiar passage. In fact, it's probably one of the most familiar passages for us that we can think of in the Bible. And it's Luke 22. It's a passage that talks about the Last Supper, and the purpose statement is to claim the sacrament of communion as an indispensable means of grace that blesses us on multiple levels. And it's interesting. It's an interesting lesson because we sometimes, like many things in the Bible, we really don't take time to look at them. We hear a passage. We certainly, in the Methodist Church, every first Sunday of the month we have communion, and sometimes it's just something we go through. It's just on the first Sunday of the month we're going to have communion. And so this lesson will help us identify and focus a little bit about who we are and how we got where we are. And our quarterly points out, I thought it was appropriate to do so, that not every church serves communion in the same way. They don't have the same process. I dare say that this is a COVID-related thing. I don't think that we will ever see communion by intinction ever again. I think that's something a few years from now, when somebody mentions intinction, people will go, what are you talking about? Never heard of that before. But it does. It's different. It's different. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So we've gone through this. This is a fourth week of getting a better understanding of who we are. And the lesson comes from Luke, and it starts in Luke 22, verse 14. When the time came, Jesus took his place at the table, and the apostles joined him. He said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I tell you, I won't eat it until it is fulfilled in God's kingdom. After taking a cup and giving thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. I tell you that from now on I won't drink from the fruit of the vine until God's kingdom has come. After taking the bread and giving thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup after the meal and said, this is the cup of the new covenant by my blood, which is poured out for you. As I say, that's a familiar passage. That's a passage that we hear those words on the first Sunday of every month in the Methodist Church. It's words that we hear any time that the communion is served. But let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at this passage and what this really means to us. Now Luke, the whole book of Luke, is all about the journey. It's Christ's journey to the cross. I mean, if you think about it, it's like a travel journal. Because Luke talks about how Jesus taught. He tells wonderful stories and shares wonderful stories about Jesus' teaching. He talks about Jesus' healing. He talks about Jesus' preaching. And all the while he's preparing his apostles for later ministry without his physical presence. Now, our lesson begins when the time came. Now, I think it's important to point out that here, once again, when you look at this journal and you look at the book of Luke, you think about everything that Jesus did, and you get this strong sense that Jesus was always in control. He didn't leave things to the last moment. He put these plans in place, and they had already been made. during the Passover feast and in Jerusalem at this period of time, houses basically were one room on the bottom with a smaller room on the second floor, and they were all built the same way. And so the house was divided into these two rooms. There was one description I read, it said they kind of looked like a big box with a small box on top of them. And this upper room, you could get to it from an outside stair. I think it's also interesting that during Passover, every room was free. The people in Jerusalem wanted the pilgrims to come. They wanted to give them housing. They wanted them to come for the Passover. And so rooms were free. Now, it was very typical that the upper room was used for a rabbi to meet with his closest disciples. And we talked last week about the fact that a rabbi was a teacher. And he wanted a place where he could go, where he could talk things over with them, where he could open up his heart to them. These were his closest friends that he was teaching. And Jesus had taken steps ahead of time to make sure that he had that particular room. You'll remember the story where he sent Peter and John into the city. And he told them specifically to look for a man bearing a jug of water. Now, carrying water was a woman's job. So to see a man carrying water wouldn't be hard to find who Jesus was talking about. And so they went into the city, they found a man that was carrying a jug of water, and he was the man that led them to this room. So it was all a prearranged signal that Jesus had set up between him and a friend. And so the feast went on. And Jesus used these ancient symbols that we read about in other passages in the Bible, but he gave them a new meaning. He said of the bread, "This is my body." When he said that, he was making bread a sacrament. Now, a sacrament is something, it's usually a very ordinary thing. It's acquired a meaning all by itself because it's something that for people that have the eyes to see and the heart to understand, it's something special to them. There's no special theological meaning about it. It could be a lot of different things. I mean, if you think about it, in every one of our houses, we've got a file, a drawer, a box that's got things in it that are meaningful to us. They're not meaningful to anybody else. Many times they're letters. I shared back during Memorial Day about some of Judy's family, and she had two cousins that were killed during World War II. And when their sister died, her daughter found these letters, and they're special. We read them. Judy's got those letters now, and they mean something. I've got letters. I've got letters that my mother wrote back when I was in high school and college. My mother had one of the ways that she talked, and I mean even before high school, if there was something that there was some conflict, we didn't agree with each other, and there was something that I was doing she wasn't happy with, or I was wrestling with an issue with a friend, or with something going on in school, and very often she would write a letter. And sometimes she'd just leave it on my pillow to read before I went to bed at night. She'd write letters when I was in college, when as an adult. And those letters mean something to me. They mean something special to me, nobody else but me. And I dare say you've got letters, you've got things like that too, and they're a sacrament. And that's what Jesus was doing here. He was touching them with something that was important to help them remember. And so that's the sacrament which we eat, the bread which we eat, is common bread. But for those of us who have a heart and have this sense of a relationship with Christ, to us it's the very body of Christ. He said of the cup, "This cup is a new covenant, made it the price of my blood." Now, in the biblical sense, a covenant is a relationship between man and God. We've been talking about covenants. We've been talking about covenants through several different lessons, and as we looked at Exodus, we've also heard about them in worship services as the sermon series has been on Exodus. And so the continuation of that covenant depends on us keeping this pledge and obeying the law. And man alone can't do that because of our sinful nature. And so we have to have this relationship, this covenant with God. And so what Jesus said was that by my life and by my death, I have made possible a new relationship between you and God. You're sinners. But because I died for you, God is not your enemy, but your friend. It cost the life of Christ to restore this lost relationship of friendship between God and man. And then Jesus said, do this and it will make you remember me. I think that's interesting. I've heard that passage many times. I've heard Jesus' words many times, but I never really thought much about it until I started preparing this lesson. Do this, and it will make you remember me. Jesus knew how easily we forget, and we do. I mean, let's just admit we do. The Greeks had an adjective which they used to describe time, and they said that time wipes all things out. And I think about that. I think about the number of things in my life as I look back over my life that they dim. We don't think about them as much, that we don't reflect on them as much. And so what Jesus was saying, in the rush and press of things, you're going to forget me. And man forgets because he does. So sometimes in the peace and the stillness of my house, I want you to do this with my people and remember me. And what made the tragedy all the more tragic was at that very table there was a person, the one who was going to be a traitor to Jesus Christ. And yet that's a reminder that we're going to be at the table with people that we don't necessarily agree with, that we've got challenges with. The term Holy Communion invites us to focus on this self-giving of God, which makes this sacrifice an occasion of grace and the holiness of our communion with God and one another. There are several terms for it. The Eucharist comes from the Greek word for thanksgiving, and it reminds us that the sacrament is thanksgiving to God for the gifts of creation and salvation. The term Mass, used by the Roman Catholic Church, derives its name from the Latin word missio, which means sending forth, and indicates that after this celebration we're sent forth out into the world. The Divine Liturgy is a name used mostly by churches in Eastern Orthodoxy. All of these refer to the same practice, the eating and the drinking of consecrated bread and wine in the worship community. Now, our lesson points out that the United Methodists affirm the real presence of Christ, but at the same time acknowledge that it's a mystery. And again, that was something that I really had not focused on. I actually, like I do once in a while when I have a question about something or I'm looking for a little additional guidance, I spoke to Jonathan about it. And he shared with me the Methodist understanding of Holy Communion, and it was a fascinating read. It's a 26-page document. And I encourage you, I mean, ask me for it, I'll be glad to send it to you. Ask Jonathan for it, and he'll be glad to send it. But we call it this Holy Mystery, and I've heard that term for a long time, every time we take communion. But I never really knew what it meant. I never really understood this Holy Mystery. And it's a United Methodist understanding that we started focusing on a couple of decades ago. And it's to reflect on United Methodism's efforts to reclaim our sacramental heritage and be in accord with ecumenical movements. This Holy Mystery is characterized by the effort to avoid rigidity on one hand and indifference on the other. The service itself, the communion service itself, was moved from the back of the Methodist hymnal to the front of the Methodist hymnal. And I never really thought much about that or why that happened. But it is. It's because it was to give it more importance, to give it more relevance. As I said, Luke's gospel is a journey. It's a journal of following Christ as he journeyed toward the cross. Jesus many times on this journey placed value on the table. Throughout Luke, it was one of the most significant social events that took place. Jesus liked to bring family and friends together. I've often thought about communion, that when we take communion, we're really witnessing a little bit of heaven. It gives us a little glimpse into heaven. Our lesson writer, started out sharing a story about the 1984 movie Places in the Heart. And I don't remember seeing that movie. I'm going to try to find it. But it was an interesting story because at the end of that movie, it was done in a Baptist church. There had been a lot of conflicts in the town. There had been a sheriff murdered. And yet, at the end of the movie, there was a scene where different people in the town were all there and sharing communion with each other, one next to the other. I had an experience a little bit like that at a church that we attended a number of years ago between Good Friday and Easter. And on that Saturday, there was a service that wasn't in the church, wasn't where we typically had worship, but it was in a chapel that was on the church property. And we served communion to each other. And so it was a pretty big group, and we started at one point in the group, the first person in the first row, and they turned to the next person, and they shared communion with them. And then that person took the elements and turned to the person to the right of them. And that touched me. And it was interesting because people were fumbling with the elements. They weren't sure what to say. They kind of stumbled through those words. And it was partly that here Christ was gone. We didn't know when we were thinking about that period of time, that Saturday, when we didn't know what happened. Christ had been crucified and was not yet risen. And what that must have been like without Christ being present there. And yet we were trying to hang on, and there were people there that every church has conflicts. In case you don't know that, there are conflicts within a church. Members of a church, of a local church, don't always agree. And yet when we come together, we're supposed to be coming together with this sense of unity. That's what Passover was. To put aside our differences. It's powerful when we think about that. I think about what would happen if the only qualification if the minister said, okay, I've consecrated the elements, you're welcome to come to the table, but you have to put all your challenges aside. You got to put all of your feelings aside that are negative toward anybody else or anything, and then you can come and take communion. It'd be interesting to see what would happen. One of the questions that was asked in the lesson was, have you ever taken communion at another church? And what was that experience like? You know, Judy and I, when we travel, and certainly haven't been traveling as much as we used to, but when we travel, if we're somewhere on a Sunday, we like to go to church. And very often, if it's a town that we haven't been in before, if it's a place we haven't been in, then we try to find a church. And we don't always just single out a Methodist church. We go to different denominations. We go to Episcopal churches. It doesn't really make any difference. We just want to go worship, and we want to worship with other people. And it's different as we go to those churches because they have a different way of serving communion, and it's interesting to see how they do that. Yet we're all there at the table, every one of us, people that we don't know, but that are there worshiping Christ. You know, I liken it a lot, and I got to thinking about this week. I haven't been to a family reunion in a long time. When I was little, it was a very common thing. We used to have family reunions. And when you go to a family reunion, especially when you're pretty young, you got to go through all that stuff. You're seeing people that you don't remember their names, you don't really know who they are, and they always ask you the same thing. Well, now, are you whose people are you? You're Marguerite's side of the family, right? I don't know. Look at Dad. Yeah. And these are Roberts. Oh, okay. Well, you're a Roberts. Well, really not. I'm Hodgson. But the point is, here are all these people that we don't see on a regular basis, and yet we're all related. We all have a common bond, and that's what, when we come to the communion table, that's what we're doing. We are related. We are related because of our faith. We're all children of God. We all walk with a limp, and yet we're here together. And I think that's so important. I wonder, and I've been reflecting on that this week as I was working through this lesson. I wonder if some of the conflict that's going on, what it would be like to be in a room with somebody that you just are totally polar opposites of, and yet you came to the communion table. And I got a feeling, as I said before, that's a little glimpse of what heaven's going to be like. It's powerful. We're not going to serve communion the same way. It's not going to feel the same in the Methodist Church. I feel fairly certain about that. I haven't got any, nobody's told me anything. This is pure supposition on my part that I don't think we're going to have communion by intinction. I don't know if we're going to continue to have the little cups, probably. But the fact is, it is this holy mystery. We know when we take communion that Christ is with us. We know today, everything that we do, Christ is with us. And when we come to the communion table, we come as one body. Will you pray with me, my friends? We thank you for the grace that you show in the Sacrament of Communion. We thank you for forgiving our individual sins and for offering grace that can make us better people. We thank you for the grace that forgives the church for creating division where you wanted unity. Help us share the fellowship with persons of other denominations. Give us an earnest desire to experience the full fellowship that you have waiting for us at the resurrection. And as we go throughout this week, keep our eyes open to those things you want us to see, our ears open to the things you want us to hear, and our hearts overflowing with that love that you have put in each and every one of us. In his name we pray. Amen. I love you, my friends, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.